My name is Melody, 30 years old, and exactly 15 days ago, I underwent a grueling emergency surgical delivery to bring my daughter into this world. As a forensic accountant, I spent my entire career tracking hidden assets and exposing financial deceptions, yet I completely failed to see the massive fraud sitting right across my own dining table. It took a single digital notification to unravel a meticulously crafted illusion of a perfect marriage and send my entire world crashing down. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated your worth and tried to break your spirit. The nursery was suffocatingly warm and cluttered with discarded receiving blankets, half-empty bottles, and the overwhelming scent of absolute exhaustion. I sat in the center of the dimly lit room in a worn rocking chair, clutching my crying newborn daughter Lily tightly against my chest. Every single microscopic movement sent a searing jolt of agony, radiating outward from the fresh surgical incision across my lower abdomen. My body felt shattered, completely drained of vitality after 2 sleepless weeks of round-the-clock feedings and zero support from the man who promised to be my partner in everything. Across the room, my husband Brandon moved with infuriating, unbothered grace. At 32 years old, holding a prestigious position as a vice president of wealth management, he always prioritized his flawless aesthetic above all else. He was currently zipping up his black designer luggage, carefully smoothing out the fabric of his perfectly tailored trousers. He looked immaculate. His thick dark hair was expertly styled, his jaw sharply lined, and his expensive Italian leather shoes gleamed faintly under the soft glow of the nursery nightlight. The stark contrast between my bleeding, exhausted reality and his pristine, wealthy exterior felt like a heavy physical blow to my chest. Lily wailed louder, her tiny face turning a deep shade of crimson as she arched her fragile back in severe distress. I winced desperately, trying to adjust my hold on her without pulling my fresh stitches. Brandon did not offer to help. He did not step forward to comfort his child or his wife. Instead, he let out a heavy, exaggerated sigh and rubbed his temples with a theatrical display of annoyance. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the crying infant, then gestured broadly toward his own head, pantomiming a severe, unbearable headache. Through a series of dismissive hand waves and dramatic eye rolls, he communicated exactly what he thought of his newborn daughter. Her noise was simply too much for him. It was severely damaging his delicate mental well-being. He grabbed a sleek glass bottle from his leather travel bag and sprayed a heavy cloud of expensive designer cologne into the air. The sharp, musky scent instantly overpowered the small room, burning my nose and causing Lily to cough violently in my arms. He checked his heavy luxury watch, adjusted his pristine shirt cuffs, and grabbed the handle of his expensive suitcase. He was leaving for a week-long boys' trip to New York. He needed to decompress, to escape the unbearable stress of a household he had barely contributed to since we brought our baby home from the hospital. He walked out of the nursery without a single backward glance. There was no reassuring touch on my shoulder, no gentle pat on his daughter's head, no promise to call when his flight landed safely. The heavy wooden front door clicked shut a moment later, sealing my isolation. From the nursery window, I watched his sleek silver sports car back out of the sprawling driveway. The powerful engine revved aggressively, shattering the quiet suburban morning before speeding away down the pristine, tree-lined street. The bright red taillights disappeared around the corner, taking with them any lingering hope I possessed for a supportive and loving partnership. The profound silence of the massive house settled around me, broken only by the persistent echoing cries of my newborn. I closed my eyes, letting the hot tears spill over my eyelashes and track down my pale cheeks. The physical pain in my abdomen was entirely eclipsed by the crushing weight of utter abandonment. I was completely alone in a cavernous, multi-million-dollar home, bleeding, terrified, and entirely responsible for a fragile human life. Taking a shaky, shallow breath, I slowly reached across the small side table to grab my phone. My fingers trembled as I navigated to my contact list, desperately seeking any form of assistance. I tapped my mother's name, pressing the cool glass of the screen against my ear as the phone began to ring. I prayed silently for her to pick up, for her to tell me she would drive over immediately and help me navigate this terrifying isolation. The phone rang 5 times. The sharp, automated beep of her voicemail echoed in my ear, signaling her unavailability. I lowered the phone to my lap, a heavy sob tearing through my raw throat. The feeling of utter helplessness threatened to consume me entirely. I felt as though I were drowning in a vast, dark ocean with no land in sight. I stared blankly at the dark screen of my phone, trying to gather the necessary strength to simply stand up and walk to the kitchen for a glass of water. Just as I shifted my weight, a bright notification illuminated the screen, casting a harsh white glare across my tear-stained face. It was an automated alert from the banking application installed on my device. Due to my extensive background as a forensic accountant, I had long ago established strict, immediate alerts for any transactions exceeding a specific threshold on all my financial accounts, including the joint credit card I shared with Brandon for household emergencies. I stared at the glowing rectangle, my blurry vision slowly bringing the text into sharp focus. The notification detailed a massive, freshly processed charge from a major commercial airline. The sheer size of the transaction immediately triggered my analytical instincts, momentarily pushing aside the heavy fog of postpartum depression and physical agony. I swiped the screen to open the secure banking application, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The detailed transaction log loaded instantly. The charge was for 2 first-class airline tickets. The departure city was our local airport. The destination was John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. The departure time was scheduled for exactly 2 hours from the current moment. The numbers glaring back at me refused to make any logical sense within the narrative Brandon had just presented. He had explicitly claimed he was traveling to New York to meet a large group of his former college friends for a relaxing, heavily planned group vacation. In all the years I had known him, his friend group meticulously booked their own individual travel arrangements, splitting costs through payment applications to maximize their personal reward points. Brandon had never once purchased a flight for another man. I looked down at Lily, whose breathing had finally settled into a soft, rhythmic pattern. Her tiny, innocent face was completely oblivious to the massive betrayal unfolding around her. She deserved a father who would fiercely protect her, not a man who viewed her very existence as an unbearable inconvenience to his lifestyle. I gently traced the soft curve of her cheek, making a silent, unbreakable vow to shield her from the toxicity that had just walked out our front door. The sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate we lived in was purchased entirely through my own premarital trust fund, a fact Brandon conveniently chose to ignore whenever he paraded around the property like a king in his castle. I had generously added his name to the administrative paperwork purely out of love and a misguided sense of marital unity. He contributed absolutely nothing to the acquisition of the home, yet he occupied the space with an overwhelming sense of unearned entitlement. This house was my sanctuary, built on my hard work and financial prudence, and he had just desecrated it with his blatant, cruel deception. I shifted my focus back to the glowing screen of my phone. My thumb hovered over the detailed transaction breakdown, analyzing every available piece of metadata provided by the banking institution. The confirmation code, the ticketing agency, the specific timestamp of the purchase. It had been executed exactly 20 minutes before he walked into the nursery to perform his theatrical display of exhaustion. He had purchased the tickets while sitting in the driveway inside his sports car, ensuring the transaction would not process until he was fully packed and ready to escape. The calculated nature of the purchase sent a fresh wave of ice water through my veins. This was not a spontaneous mistake or a sudden change of plans. This was a premeditated operation. He had likely planned this escape for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment when my physical recovery would render me completely incapacitated and unable to question his movements. He believed I was too weak, too distracted by the demanding needs of a newborn to notice the glaring inconsistencies in his story. The sheer arrogance required to charge an illicit romantic getaway to a joint financial account monitored by a forensic accountant was staggering. It spoke to a level of hubris that only a man completely detached from reality could possess. He felt entirely untouchable. He believed his position as a vice president of wealth management made him the smartest person in any room, completely underestimating the quiet, analytical woman he had married. But numbers, unlike people, do not possess the capacity to lie. They do not manipulate, they do not gaslight, and they do not wear expensive cologne to mask their true intentions. Two highly expensive first-class tickets booked at the absolute last possible minute on our joint emergency account. The mathematical impossibility of the situation activated the deeply ingrained forensic training in my mind. The numbers were not aligning with the stated facts. The financial footprint directly contradicted the provided alibi. A week-long boys' trip did not require a spontaneous, exorbitant purchase of a secondary luxury ticket. The heavy, musky scent of his expensive cologne still lingering in the nursery air suddenly felt less like a grooming habit and more like a deliberate, calculated preparation for an entirely different kind of encounter. He had dressed with meticulous, obsessive care. He had sprayed a scent reserved for special, intimate occasions. He had practically sprinted out the door with a level of eager anticipation that completely betrayed his supposedly exhausted, stressed demeanor. The dark seed of suspicion took firm root in the fertile soil of my broken heart. The narrative of the overwhelmed, exhausted new father seeking a mental health break completely unraveled, exposing the ugly, terrifying truth lurking just beneath the surface. He was not flying to New York to decompress with his male friends. He was flying to New York with someone else. The sheer audacity of his deception executed while I sat bleeding and crying with our 15-day-old infant ignited a fierce burning heat deep within my chest. The crushing despair of abandonment was instantly replaced by a sharp, highly focused clarity. The tears dried on my cheeks. The physical pain in my surgical incision faded into the background, overshadowed by the massive surge of adrenaline flooding my system. I was a professional investigator of financial deceit. I had spent a decade dismantling complex corporate frauds, uncovering hidden offshore accounts, and destroying the carefully constructed lies of wealthy, arrogant men. Brandon had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had assumed my current physical vulnerability equated to mental weakness. He had mistaken my exhaustion for ignorance. He had foolishly used a traceable financial instrument connected to a system monitored by a woman who built her entire career on following the money. As I sat in the dim nursery holding my sleeping daughter, the victim vanished. In her place, a predator awoke, ready to meticulously dismantle the life of the man who had just walked out that door. The fierce clarity that had just ignited within my mind was abruptly, violently shattered by the sound of heavy fists pounding against the solid oak of my front door. Before I could even shift my weight to stand, the heavy deadbolt clicked open. Brandon had obviously given them his spare key without consulting me. Heavy footsteps echoed through the grand foyer, instantly violating the fragile sanctuary of my home. I clutched Lily tighter to my chest, ignoring the sharp pulling sensation in my surgical incision as I forced myself to walk out of the nursery and peer over the second-floor mahogany railing. Marching into my grand entryway was Patricia, my impeccably dressed and perpetually dissatisfied mother-in-law. Flanking her like opportunistic shadows were Brandon's younger sister Keisha and her husband Jamal. They hauled massive, overflowing overnight bags across my pristine hardwood floors, the heavy plastic wheels leaving dark scuff marks in their wake. They paraded into my home under the false pretense of familial duty, carrying themselves with the exaggerated confidence of a rescue squad arriving to assist a helpless new mother while her husband was away. Their performance was entirely transparent. The sheer volume of their luggage indicated they had no intention of providing temporary relief. This was not a supportive visit from a caring family. This was a hostile occupation of my territory. Every step they took into the house felt like a calculated invasion designed to strip away the last remaining shreds of my comfort and authority. The so-called help immediately morphed into a chaotic, parasitic occupation. My physical immobility trapped me on the second floor, temporarily powerless to physically eject them from the premises. Keisha and Jamal bypassed the stairs entirely, dropping their heavy bags in the center of the foyer and making a direct line for my custom chef's kitchen. Through the open floor plan, I watched in silent revulsion as they treated my multi-million-dollar estate like a complimentary luxury resort. They aggressively swung open the doors of my commercial-grade refrigerator, rummaging through the shelves with absolute entitlement. Keisha pulled out expensive artisan cheeses and organic produce, loudly complaining to Jamal about my lack of premium junk food and specific brand-name snacks. They tossed discarded packaging onto the pristine marble countertops, leaving a trail of sticky residue and crumb-covered plates in their wake. Jamal uncorked a vintage bottle of wine I had been saving for a special occasion, pouring generous glasses for himself and his wife, without a single shred of hesitation. They moved through my space with a greedy, hungry energy, taking whatever they wanted, simply because it was there. Their blatant disrespect rapidly escalated from the kitchen to the main living area. Jamal threw his heavy boots onto my imported Italian velvet sofa, sinking into the cushions as if he owned the property. He grabbed the remote control and commanded the massive home theater system, blasting a chaotic action movie at maximum volume. The heavy bass from the surround sound speakers vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up the structural pillars and shaking the walls of the second-story nursery. The sudden aggressive noise caused Lily to wake from her fragile sleep. She arched her tiny back, her face turning crimson as she screamed in sheer absolute terror. While Keisha and Jamal pillaged the ground floor, Patricia initiated a calculated psychological assault. She slowly ascended the grand staircase, her sharp eyes scanning every square inch of my home for perceived failures. She did not immediately ask to hold her newborn granddaughter. She did not offer a comforting word about my agonizing physical recovery. Instead, she prowled the hallway, running her manicured fingers along the top edges of the baseboards and the intricate molding of the door frames, actively hunting for microscopic specks of dust. When she finally stepped into the nursery, her presence sucked all the remaining warmth from the room. She stood over me, her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze deliberately sweeping up and down my exhausted postpartum body. She stared pointedly at my swollen abdomen, my milk-stained shirt, and my unwashed hair. Her facial expressions were a masterclass in silent condemnation. She made it painfully physically apparent through every curl of her lip and every disappointed sigh that she held me entirely responsible for Brandon's departure. In her twisted narrative, my inability to instantly bounce back from major abdominal surgery had driven her successful, handsome son out of his own home. She viewed me not as a healing mother, but as a failing wife who deserved to be abandoned. The sheer cruelty radiating from her posture was suffocating. The physical toll of standing and enduring her silent judgment sent a fresh wave of blinding pain through my lower stomach. My forensic accounting instincts, the very skills that had uncovered Brandon's betrayal just an hour prior, screamed at me to compartmentalize the trauma. Engaging in a screaming match with these parasites while physically compromised and holding a terrified infant was a tactical error. I needed absolute silence to formulate a strategy to destroy them all. I needed them to drop their guard. I retreated. Playing the role of the defeated, exhausted victim, I carefully carried Lily into the master suite and securely locked the heavy bedroom door. I laid down on the mattress, pulling the covers up to my chin, and closed my eyes, slowing my breathing to mimic a deep, medicated sleep. I allowed them to believe they had successfully broken my spirit. Downstairs, the obnoxious sounds of their occupation continued late into the evening. I listened to the clinking of my expensive crystal glasses, the booming bass of the television, and the arrogant laughter of people who believed they had successfully conquered my kingdom. Every burst of laughter from the living room fueled the cold, dark fire burning steadily in my chest. I waited in the darkness. Hours dragged by with agonizing slowness. The aggressive noises downstairs eventually faded into a heavy silence as the intruders finally retreated to my guest bedrooms. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed with a faint red light, indicating it was past 2 in the morning. The burning sensation in my surgical wound was intense, but my mind was razor-sharp, functioning with absolute clarity. I carefully slid out of bed, ensuring Lily was completely secure and deeply asleep in her bedside bassinet. I crept out of the master suite, my bare feet making zero sound against the thick hallway carpet. The house was pitch black, shadows stretching long and heavy across the walls. I moved like a ghost in my own home, tracking the presence of the invaders. As I moved silently past the staircase, I noticed a faint, erratic beam of light spilling out from beneath the door of my private home office. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I pressed my back against the cool wall and inched closer to the slightly ajar door. My home office was strictly off-limits, containing sensitive client data and my most private financial records. Looking through the narrow gap, I witnessed a scene that completely shattered any remaining illusion about this family. Keisha was inside my restricted sanctuary. She was using the harsh white flashlight from her smartphone, sweeping the beam frantically across the room. Her movements were desperate and hurried. She was aggressively yanking open the heavy mahogany drawers of my filing cabinets, tossing my meticulously organized folders onto the floor. She was tearing through my private financial records, my tax documents, and my personal bank statements, actively hunting for something specific. The parasitic invasion was not just about securing a free luxury vacation or punishing a vulnerable new mother. It was a calculated, targeted operation to infiltrate my financial defenses. I stood in the dark hallway watching my sister-in-law violate my most secure space, realizing that the war had already begun right inside my own home. I did not step forward to confront her. I simply watched, memorizing her every move, calculating my precise retaliation. The depth of their deception stretched far beyond a simple extramarital affair, and this midnight intrusion proved they were searching for vulnerabilities to exploit. The sheer audacity required to break into a secure office fueled my analytical mind, transforming my physical exhaustion into pure adrenaline. They wanted a war of attrition, hoping I would crumble under the weight of a crying infant and an occupied home, but they fundamentally misunderstood the woman they were dealing with. I committed the entire scene to memory, the exact files she touched, the specific drawers she opened, mapping out the exact boundaries of their overreach. I silently retreated back into the shadows of the hallway, leaving Keisha to her frantic, useless searching, unaware that she had just handed me the ultimate justification to destroy them all. I waited in the stifling darkness of the hallway, holding my breath as the faint beam of Keisha's smartphone flashlight finally flickered off. The heavy mahogany door of my home office clicked shut, followed by the muffled padding of her footsteps retreating toward the guest wing. I remained perfectly still, counting to 100 to ensure the hallway was entirely deserted. The grandfather clock downstairs chimed twice. It was exactly 2 in the morning. The throbbing pain radiating from my surgical incision seemed to evaporate entirely, replaced by the cold, sharp instincts of a seasoned forensic accountant. The weeping, exhausted mother who had cowered in the nursery was gone. Keisha had brazenly violated my sanctuary, but she lacked the intellect to understand the digital fortress she had attempted to breach. I stepped forward, gripping the brass handle of the office door, and slipped inside. I engaged the heavy deadbolt, plunging myself into the pitch-black room. I did not flip the light switch. Any illumination visible from beneath the door frame would alert the parasites down the hall to my presence. Instead, I navigated strictly by memory, moving silently past the filing cabinets Keisha had so clumsily ransacked. I sank into my ergonomic leather desk chair, the familiar embrace of my workstation grounding me. I reached beneath the false bottom of the lowest desk drawer, my fingers locating the cold metallic casing of my secondary laptop. This was not the standard commercial machine I used for daily tasks. This was a heavily encrypted, custom-built device loaded with specialized financial tracking software, entirely disconnected from the main household router. I powered it on. The screen cast a faint, icy blue glow across my face, illuminating the precise, calculating expression I usually reserved for dismantling corporate embezzlers. I initiated a secure virtual private network, routing my connection through multiple international servers to ensure my digital footprint remained entirely invisible to anyone monitoring the local network. Jamal fancied himself a tech-savvy individual, but his skills were rudimentary at best. I was a phantom operating within my own domain. My fingers flew across the backlit keyboard, the rhythmic clacking muted by the heavy soundproofing of the office walls. I bypassed the standard joint account dashboard accessing the raw back-end routing logs of our financial portfolio. I did not care about the superficial checking balances. I was hunting for the structural anomalies, the hidden leaks within our marital assets. It took less than 7 minutes of algorithmic sorting to find the massive gaping hole in our foundation. My eyes narrowed as a recently flagged transaction populated on the screen. $40,000 had been completely drained from our high-yield emergency savings account. The sheer audacity of the withdrawal made my jaw clench. This account was specifically designated for catastrophic events, built primarily on the interest generated by my personal trust. Brandon had initiated a wire transfer just 48 hours prior to his dramatic departure, effectively gutting our safety net while I was still in the hospital recovering from major abdominal surgery. I isolated the transaction hash and initiated a reverse trace. He had not transferred the funds to a standard checking account. He had routed the $40,000 through a secondary undisclosed limited liability company registered in Delaware, a ghost entity. The corporate registry listed a registered agent service designed to mask the true ownership. But Brandon was lazy. He had used the same digital signature pattern he applied to his golf club memberships. I shattered the LLC firewall in under 12 minutes. The $40,000 had been immediately redistributed onto a black high-limit premium credit card entirely under his sole control. He had armed himself with a massive untraceable budget for his supposed boys' trip to New York. The narrative of an exhausted new father needing a cheap weekend getaway to decompress was completely obliterated by the sheer volume of stolen capital. My heart pounded a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs, fueling the relentless drive to uncover the absolute bottom of his deceit. I needed to see exactly where that $40,000 was bleeding into. I opened a new terminal window to breach his personal email security. Brandon believed his dual-factor authentication made him untouchable. However, he had foolishly linked his recovery options to a legacy cloud server we established when we first moved into the estate, a server I maintained absolute administrative control over. I intercepted the security token mid-route silently, verifying the login without triggering a single alert on his mobile device. The inbox materialized on my screen. I bypassed the meticulously organized primary folders and dove straight into the hidden and deleted archives. Criminals always believed that pressing the delete key erased their sins. I ran a targeted search algorithm filtering the incoming messages by timestamps aligning with his recent credit card expenditures. The search results cascaded down my screen, delivering a series of devastating, undeniable truths. The first electronic receipt was from a high-end diamond boutique located on Fifth Avenue. He had swiped his newly loaded premium card for a staggering $15,000. The line item description detailed a custom-crafted platinum tennis necklace featuring flawless, brilliant-cut diamonds. My mind flashed back to the previous Christmas where he had gifted me a generic discounted blender, claiming we needed to be financially prudent with the baby coming. He had hoarded our resources, punishing me for expecting basic affection while dropping the cost of a luxury vehicle on a piece of jewelry for another woman. The second confirmation email broke the final seal on his elaborate lie. It was a booking confirmation for the Waldorf Astoria in New York. He had not rented a block of rooms for a raucous reunion with his college friends. He had reserved their most exclusive high-floor luxury suite. The reservation spanned the entire week, charging an astronomical nightly rate that perfectly aligned with his massive cash grab. I clicked on the attached PDF folio, expanding the document to scrutinize the fine print. My eyes scanned the guest registry, searching for the name of the person he deemed worthy of this sickening extravagance. There, printed in crisp, undeniable black and white ink, was the secondary guest authorized to access the luxury suite. Vanessa. The name struck me with the force of a physical blow. Vanessa was his 28-year-old junior assistant at the wealth management firm. She was a woman who frequently called our house late at night under the guise of urgent portfolio adjustments. She had attended our baby shower just months ago, smiling sweetly while handing me a pack of cheap organic diapers, expertly acting the part of the devoted, helpful subordinate. She had stood right there in my living room, admiring my custom furnishings and drinking my sparkling water while secretly plotting to dismantle my entire life. The sheer level of manipulation required to execute that kind of deception was genuinely terrifying. The image of Brandon smelling of rich designer cologne escaping his crying newborn to drape a $15,000 diamond necklace around the throat of his junior assistant in a Waldorf Astoria suite snapped my remaining tether to the vulnerable woman I used to be. I sat back in the leather chair, the sharp glow of the laptop screen, reflecting the terrifying, cold realization settling over my features. He was not just a negligent father or a cheating husband seeking a temporary escape. He was a ruthless financial predator actively draining my resources to fund a parallel luxury life with his subordinate. My fingers resumed their rapid movement across the keyboard, driven by a newfound absolute clarity. I ran a secondary sweep on the IP addresses associated with his recent logins. The geolocation data perfectly matched the hotel's exclusive private network. He was currently connected, likely sleeping soundly next to Vanessa, completely oblivious to the digital siege dismantling his secrets. The $40,000 was just the surface-level damage. If he was arrogant and brazen enough to drain our joint emergency savings and leave a digital trail this sloppy, there was an incredibly high probability that his financial misconduct extended far beyond our marital borders. He managed massive portfolios for some of the wealthiest, most ruthless institutional investors in the entire city. A man who steals from his recovering wife to fund his mistress rarely possesses the moral fortitude to keep his greedy hands out of his powerful clients' pockets. I meticulously saved the hotel folios, the diamond boutique receipts, the IP routing logs, and the LLC transfer documents to a heavily encrypted external hard drive. I created multiple redundant backups, securely storing the undeniable proof of his infidelity and grand theft in isolated cloud servers he could never hope to access. Keisha could frantically search my physical filing cabinets until her fingers bled. But the true power of this massive estate resided solely in the complex digital realm I completely commanded. I deliberately erased my search history from his email server, restoring the deleted folder to its exact previous state, ensuring he would never suspect a breach. I powered down the laptop, sliding it back into the hidden compartment beneath the desk, locking it away safely. I unbolted the office door and stepped gracefully back into the dark, silent hallway, leaving the parasitic in-laws sleeping soundly in my guest rooms. They had absolutely no idea that the vulnerable victim they thought they were torturing had just transformed into the ruthless architect of their absolute destruction. The blinding morning sun pierced through the narrow gaps in the heavy velvet curtains of the master bedroom. I had not slept a single second during the long, agonizing night. The digital revelations of the previous night burned vividly in my mind, forming a chaotic web of betrayal that I needed to systematically untangle. Downstairs, the obnoxious sounds of Patricia barking complaints at my smart speaker echoed up the grand staircase. She aggressively demanded a specific imported sparkling water I supposedly failed to stock. Keisha and Jamal were loudly debating which expensive cuts of meat they wanted to order for lunch, using the premium food delivery application linked directly to my personal checking account. They believed they were punishing a fragile, weeping woman. They had no idea they were actively funding the surveillance operation that would soon destroy their entire existence. I carefully dressed in loose, comfortable clothing to mask my surgical binder, maintaining the physical illusion of a broken, recovering victim. Before stepping out of the master suite, I retrieved a small matte black device from my secure tech lockbox. It was a high-grade microacoustic transmitter, the exact kind of professional surveillance equipment I frequently utilized during hostile corporate audits to capture off-the-record boardroom confessions. It was roughly the size of a standard coat button, featuring active noise cancellation and a battery life that could outlast their entire parasitic vacation. I slowly descended the stairs, clutching the wooden banister with exaggerated effort. Patricia watched me with a sharp gaze, offering zero assistance as I navigated the steps. I shuffled past them into the grand dining room where the massive custom oak table sat waiting for their incoming feast. I pretended to drop my mobile phone onto the thick Persian rug. As I awkwardly bent down to retrieve the device, I swiftly pressed the adhesive backing of the audio transmitter flush against the underside of the heavy wooden table directly beneath the center floral arrangement. It was completely invisible to the naked eye. I stood back up, clutching my stomach, and offered a weak, trembling apology for my clumsiness. Patricia simply rolled her eyes in profound disgust. 30 minutes later, the heavy oak double doors chimed as the premium food delivery arrived. Jamal aggressively unpacked massive containers of expensive prime rib truffle mashed potatoes and imported wine, spreading the feast across the dining table. I politely declined their insincere offer to join them, claiming my pain medication was causing severe nausea. Patricia waved her hand, practically shooing me away from my own dining area. I gratefully accepted the dismissal, carrying Lily carefully back up the stairs and into the quiet sanctuary of the nursery. I locked the heavy nursery door and gently placed Lily into her automated rocking bassinet. I pulled a small encrypted receiver from my pocket and inserted a discreet wireless earpiece into my right ear. I activated the pairing sequence. A brief burst of static hissed through the tiny speaker before instantly clearing into sharp, high-definition audio. The active noise cancellation worked flawlessly, filtering out the ambient sounds of the house and isolating the conversation happening directly below me. I could clearly hear the clinking of expensive silverware against my fine china plates and the heavy sound of Jamal pouring another generous glass of my vintage wine. I sat rigidly in the nursery chair, staring blankly at the pastel-painted wall as the audio feed streamed directly into my brain. The sheer arrogance radiating from their casual dining conversation was immediately apparent. Keisha was loudly complaining about the outdated color palette of my living room, suggesting they needed to hire a professional interior decorator the moment the dust settled. Jamal heartily agreed, chewing loudly while suggesting they should tear out my custom garden to install a massive outdoor entertainment deck. They were already redesigning a multi-million-dollar estate they did not own. Then the conversation shifted entirely, sending a fresh surge of freezing water directly into my veins. Patricia cleared her throat, her sharp voice cutting through the casual banter. She asked Keisha if Brandon had texted them from his flight. Keisha let out a sharp, cruel laugh. She confirmed that Brandon had messaged her right before takeoff. She gleefully announced that Brandon and Vanessa were already sipping complimentary champagne in the first-class cabin, completely thrilled to finally be away from the miserable screaming baby and the depressing postpartum atmosphere of the house. The physical reaction to hearing my mother-in-law and sister-in-law joke about my husband flying with his junior assistant was visceral. They all knew. Every single one of them was fully aware of the affair. They were not simply turning a blind eye to Brandon's infidelity. They were actively celebrating it. They viewed Vanessa as a massive upgrade, a younger, more compliant woman who knew how to cater to Brandon's massive ego without bringing the burdensome reality of motherhood into his pristine life. Patricia's voice dropped to a whisper, but the high-grade transmitter picked up every chilling syllable. She instructed Keisha and Jamal to intensify their efforts. She explicitly laid out a psychological warfare strategy designed to completely break my spirit. Patricia noted that I was already physically compromised from the emergency surgery and emotionally fragile from the sudden hormone shifts. She ordered them to maximize the noise levels to prevent me from sleeping, to constantly criticize my parenting skills, and to eat through my resources to create an environment of absolute hostility. The ultimate goal, Patricia explained with terrifying calmness, was to push me into a documented severe postpartum breakdown. She wanted me completely hysterical, sleep-deprived, and desperate for any form of escape. Once they pushed me past the breaking point, Brandon would swoop back in, playing the role of the concerned, rational husband. He would present me with a predetermined legal separation agreement. Under the guise of securing specialized mental health treatment for my supposed instability, they would coerce me into signing over the deed to the estate. I had purchased this house entirely with my personal premarital trust, but they planned to use my manufactured mental collapse to manipulate the asset division. The darkest, most evil part of their conspiracy was revealed a moment later. Jamal asked about the baby. Patricia coldly stated that Lily was merely a bargaining chip. They planned to leverage my documented emotional instability to force me into relinquishing primary custody. They did not actually want to raise my daughter. They knew the threat of losing my child would terrify me into surrendering the financial assets without a fight. Once Brandon secured the house and the majority of the wealth, he would simply hire a team of full-time nannies to manage Lily out of sight. The path would then be entirely clear for Vanessa to move her things into my master bedroom, permanently taking my place in the life I had built. I sat frozen in the nursery chair, the audio feed continuing to stream directly into my ear. They were laughing now, clinking their wine glasses together in a cheerful toast to their brilliant strategy. They genuinely believed I was a weak, gullible woman crying myself to sleep just a few feet above their heads. They thought my postpartum bleeding and exhaustion made me an easy target for their emotional terrorism. They had severely miscalculated the depth of my resilience and the sheer magnitude of the vengeance I was now prepared to unleash upon their pathetic, greedy lives. My hands were not shaking. My breathing was slow, steady, and entirely controlled. I reached up and smoothly pulled the wireless earpiece from my ear, severing the audio connection to the monsters dining below. The silence in the nursery was profound, grounding me in the immediate reality of my situation. I looked down at Lily, peacefully sleeping in her bassinet, completely unaware that her own blood relatives had just plotted to use her as a disposable pawn in a fraudulent real estate acquisition. The tears I had shed yesterday, the desperate sobbing, the fear of abandonment evaporated entirely. The victim mentality that had clouded my judgment dissolved into absolute nothingness, leaving behind a barren landscape of cold, calculating rage. A sharp, terrifying clarity washed over my entire being. They wanted to orchestrate a legal and psychological war to steal my child and my home. They wanted to paint me as a broken, hysterical failure to justify their own parasitic greed. I stood up from the rocking chair, ignoring the dull ache in my abdomen. I walked to the mirror hanging above the changing table and stared directly into my own eyes. The woman looking back at me was a predator fully awakened and ready to hunt. I would not just defend my territory. I would systematically, financially, and legally obliterate every single person sitting at that dining room table. The time for crying was officially over. It was time to go to war. Stepping away from the nursery mirror, I felt an icy calm wash over my entire body. I walked back to my locked home office, leaving my sleeping daughter safe in her bassinet. I retrieved my encrypted laptop from its hidden compartment and powered it up. I bypassed the standard security protocols and launched a highly secure private video conferencing application. I dialed the direct line of my private wealth attorney, Jonathan. Jonathan was a ruthless, brilliant legal mind operating out of a top-tier firm in downtown Chicago. He had managed my family's assets for over a decade and possessed a profound understanding of complex financial structures. His face appeared on my screen, perfectly framed by his sleek, glass-walled office. He took one look at my expression and immediately closed the blinds to his office, securing his environment. He knew I would not initiate an encrypted channel unless a catastrophic financial event was actively unfolding. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him my husband was currently engaging in a coordinated financial and legal conspiracy with his family to strip me of my assets and claim primary custody of my newborn daughter. Jonathan's professional demeanor hardened instantly into predatory focus. He reached for a fresh legal pad, pulling a silver pen from his desk organizer. I initiated the screen sharing protocol on our secure connection, ensuring our digital footprint was completely masked from any outside surveillance. I pulled up the original deed and the complete transaction history for the sprawling multi-million-dollar estate I currently occupied. I needed to establish an absolute, undeniable baseline of ownership before we launched our counteroffensive. The documents displayed vividly on the high-definition monitor, painting a crystal-clear picture of my true wealth. I had purchased this massive property entirely through my premarital trust fund, a financial safety net established long before I ever met Brandon. The wire transfers prove that every single cent of the down payment, the closing costs, and the ongoing property taxes originated exclusively from my personal portfolio. Brandon had never contributed a single dollar to the acquisition or maintenance of the estate. His entire salary as a wealth management vice president had always been funneling into his own private accounts and apparently into the pockets of his mistress. I had generously added his name to the administrative paperwork shortly after our wedding, simply as a gesture of marital courtesy. I had wanted him to feel like an equal partner in our home. Now that very courtesy was being weaponized against me by his greedy, opportunistic family. I highlighted the specific clauses in my prenuptial agreement, demonstrating that Brandon had absolutely no legal standing to force a sale or claim equity in the property, regardless of Patricia's malicious psychological warfare. Jonathan reviewed the highlighted documents with rapid efficiency, his eyes scanning the digital text. He confirmed that my foresight in maintaining the original trust structures provided us with an impenetrable legal fortress. I instructed him to draft the necessary injunctions immediately. Operating with ruthless precision, we began systematically severing Brandon from my empire. I digitally signed a heavy stack of complex legal documents using my secure biometric authentication. The first injunction completely stripped Brandon of all property access rights, formally revoking the marital courtesy that had allowed his name on the administrative deed. He was now legally nothing more than a trespassing guest in my own home. The second maneuver was even more devastating. I executed a massive asset transfer, moving the entire estate and all associated liquid capital into an impenetrable blind trust. I named my 15-day-old daughter Lily as the sole beneficiary of this multi-million-dollar fortress. I designated myself as the absolute sole executor, retaining complete and unquestionable control over the assets until Lily reached adulthood. This specific legal structure meant that even if Patricia and her parasitic crew successfully fabricated a mental health crisis to challenge my competency, they could never touch the house. The property was no longer a marital asset they could divide. It belonged entirely to my infant daughter, protected by federal trust laws that Brandon could never hope to breach. The satisfying sound of digital stamps confirming the legal transfers echoed through the quiet office, validating my absolute control over the situation. My wealth was now completely insulated from their greedy, grasping hands. With the physical estate locked down behind an ironclad legal wall, I turned my attention to his immediate liquidity. I opened a secondary window on my monitor, accessing the back-end portal of our primary banking institution. I navigated to the credit card management dashboard, isolating the premium black card Brandon was currently using to fund his illicit romantic getaway at the Waldorf Astoria. I possessed master administrative privileges over this specific account, a detail his towering arrogance had caused him to completely overlook. I highlighted every single secondary card issued under his name. I did not simply cancel them. Canceling the cards immediately would alert him to my awareness, giving him time to panic and potentially secure alternative funding or drain other vulnerable accounts before I could build my full case. I needed him to remain completely blind and overconfident until the absolute last possible second. His entire facade relied on the illusion of limitless wealth and unbroken control. Stripping him of that illusion prematurely would ruin the devastating impact of my grand finale. Using my advanced forensic accounting software, I wrote a custom algorithmic script and embedded it directly into the banking portal's fraud prevention system. I meticulously coded a delayed trigger mechanism tied directly to the merchant identification code of his luxury hotel in New York. The script was programmed to lie dormant, allowing his lavish room service charges, expensive dinners, and extravagant city tours to process normally throughout the entire week. The trap needed to be absolutely flawless to ensure his maximum humiliation. The total financial freeze would only activate at the exact moment he stood at the front desk and attempted to process his final checkout payment. At that precise second, the system would automatically decline the transaction, lock the account for suspected fraudulent activity, and permanently revoke his authorization. He would be left standing in the opulent lobby of one of the most expensive hotels in the country, staring at a declined card with absolutely no way to pay a bill spanning thousands of dollars. His mistress would be standing right beside him, witnessing his complete financial emasculation in real time. I watched the bright green confirmation text flash rapidly across my dark screen, verifying that the delayed trigger was successfully locked into the banking mainframe. Jonathan watched my digital maneuvers through the screen share, an expression of profound professional respect settling over his sharp features. He knew better than to offer unsolicited advice when I was operating at this level of calculated intensity. He promised to have the physical copies of the property injunctions and the blind trust documentation filed with the county clerk before the courthouse officially closed that afternoon, ensuring the legal boundaries were set in stone. I thanked him for his rapid deployment of the legal strikes and terminated the secure video connection, the screen fading back to black. The heavy silence of my home office wrapped around me once more, providing a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I had just unleashed upon my husband's future. I sat back in my high-backed office chair, rolling my aching shoulders to release the lingering physical tension from my recent surgery. I closed my eyes and listened carefully to the faint but extremely obnoxious sounds of Jamal and Keisha continuing their arrogant feast down in my dining room. I could hear the muffled thumping of a heavy bass line, indicating they had turned the television back on, unbothered by the disruption. They were still celebrating their supposed victory over a weak postpartum woman, completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath their feet no longer legally belonged to their family. They were cheering for a conquest that had already been entirely dismantled, piece by precise piece. The financial and legal traps were now perfectly set, operating silently in the background of their impending doom. I had successfully protected my daughter, insulated my multi-million-dollar estate, and orchestrated the upcoming financial humiliation of a cheating husband who thought he held all the power. However, simply protecting my assets was no longer sufficient for me. I needed to ensure Brandon could never again wield power over anyone else in his miserable life. I opened a new highly secured window on my laptop, turning my absolute undivided attention toward his corporate firm network. The defensive perimeter was fully established, protecting my borders and my child. Now I needed to actively hunt for the evidence that would ultimately destroy his career and ensure his permanent incarceration. Brandon was a vice president of wealth management at one of the most prestigious financial institutions in the city. The firm prided itself on impenetrable digital security, heavily guarded client portfolios, and an elite roster of institutional investors. What their arrogant board of directors had completely forgotten was that 5 years ago, during their massive system migration, they had contracted my forensic accounting agency to stress test their new architecture. I had personally designed the foundational blueprints for their secondary security firewalls, identifying potential vulnerabilities and patching their blind spots. I knew the exact layout of their digital vault because I had helped build the very walls protecting it. I also knew exactly where I had intentionally left a deeply buried, highly encrypted administrative backdoor strictly for emergency diagnostic access. They had never bothered to close it, assuming their internal IT department had full domain control. They were catastrophically wrong. My fingers began a rapid, rhythmic dance across the illuminated keyboard. I launched a customized penetration script, masking my external IP address through a cascading series of international proxies. I did not attempt a brute force entry through the front gates. Instead, I slipped silently through the forgotten service entrance, bypassing the primary authentication nodes without triggering a single internal alarm. The firm's massive internal database materialized on my screen, a sprawling, complex ocean of raw financial data, high-net-worth client portfolios, and institutional trading ledgers. I was fully inside the system, operating completely undetected as a digital ghost. I began to sift through the massive volume of information, applying specialized filtering algorithms designed to isolate Brandon's specific executive access credentials. I needed to see precisely what he was doing with his high-tier clients. The initial sweep revealed the standard authorized transactions expected of his position portfolio, rebalancing mutual fund allocations, and standard fee assessments. It all looked perfectly legal, entirely above board, and meticulously documented. But seasoned forensic accountants know that the most devastating crimes are never committed in the bright light of the primary ledger. I dug deeper, shifting my focus toward the firm's most powerful and lucrative client, Dominic was a ruthless billionaire investor, a man notorious in the financial sector for destroying companies and bankrupting rivals without a second thought. Dominic's massive private equity portfolio represented the absolute crown jewel of Brandon's professional career. It was the sole reason Brandon had been promoted to vice president. Managing Dominic's wealth gave my husband an unearned aura of prestige and invincibility. I isolated Dominic's primary holding accounts, isolating the specific data stream, to examine the microtransactions. I deployed a secondary algorithm, a proprietary sequence I designed specifically to detect fractional skimming and phantom routing within massive capital pools. The progress bar on my screen inched forward, analyzing thousands of complex financial movements in mere seconds. The software suddenly chimed a soft muted alert. The screen flashed, highlighting a glaring structural anomaly buried deep beneath layers of automated trading reports. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned closer to the monitor. I opened the flagged directory, uncovering a deeply hidden secondary ledger, completely disconnected from the firm's official reporting software. Brandon had not simply been mismanaging funds or executing poor trades. He had constructed an elaborate, highly sophisticated embezzlement pipeline. The digital paper trail laid out a staggering, undeniable narrative of grand corporate theft. He was systematically siphoning money directly from Dominic's private accounts, utilizing a method known as fractional diversion. He would initiate massive legitimate trades for the billionaire, but intentionally scrape fractions of a percentage off the top during the capital transfer process. Because Dominic's portfolio dealt in the hundreds of millions, these stolen fractions added up to an astronomical sum without ever setting off the automated loss alerts. The stolen capital was then routed into a complex web of anonymous shell companies registered in offshore tax havens. I meticulously traced the routing numbers following the stolen money as it flowed through the dark channels of the financial sector. The total amount embezzled over the past 2 years glowed on my screen in sharp, undeniable digits. $2,400,000. My husband was stealing millions from a man capable of ending his life with a single phone call. The sheer reckless stupidity of his actions sent a chilling tremor down my spine. Brandon was not just a cheating, arrogant narcissist. He was a federal criminal operating on borrowed time. I needed to see exactly how he was spending the billionaire's stolen capital. I breached the primary offshore shell company, cross-referencing the outbound expenditures with the local vendors. The resulting data stream painted a sickening portrait of pure, unadulterated greed. The money was not being hoarded in a secret savings account. It was being actively, aggressively liquidated to fund a spectacular fantasy life. The first cluster of outbound transfers led directly to a luxury automotive dealership. The sleek silver sports car he had aggressively revved in my driveway mere hours ago, the one he claimed was a hard-earned reward for his recent promotion, was entirely funded by Dominic's stolen money. He was driving a stolen asset, treating it as a trophy of his own fabricated success. The second cluster of transactions illuminated the true extent of his affair with Vanessa. The junior assistant was not merely a romantic distraction, she was an active, willing participant in his financial crimes. The stolen funds were being routed to pay for her lavish upscale apartment downtown. He was using the billionaire's money to purchase her designer wardrobes, exclusive spa treatments, and premium international vacations. The $15,000 diamond necklace he had just purchased in New York was merely a drop in the ocean compared to the sheer volume of stolen capital he had already showered upon her. But the absolute most enraging discovery materialized in the final cluster of bank routing data. The parasitic occupation currently occurring downstairs in my home was entirely interconnected with his federal crimes. Brandon was actively utilizing the embezzled funds to bankroll Keisha and Jamal. I pulled up a staggering list of direct deposits transferred from the offshore shell company directly into Jamal's personal checking account. Brandon was paying off their mounting credit card debts, funding their expensive imported clothing habits, and providing them with a massive monthly stipend. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Patricia's cruel, relentless mocking, Keisha's entitled arrogance, and Jamal's aggressive behavior were all entirely funded by stolen money. They treated me like a worthless, burdensome failure because Brandon was secretly showering them with stolen cash, buying their absolute loyalty and securing their enthusiastic participation in his affairs. He had purchased his family's devotion using a billionaire's stolen capital, orchestrating a grand illusion of superiority while my legitimate hard-earned trust fund provided the very roof over their heads. They believed they were the elite, untouchable upper class, looking down upon a weak, recovering woman. In reality, they were nothing more than bottom-feeding criminals actively complicit in a massive federal fraud scheme. Every expensive meal they ate, every luxury item they flaunted, was a direct result of grand larceny. The absolute hypocrisy of their existence fueled the cold, calculating rage burning steadily within my chest. I reached into the top drawer of my desk and retrieved a military-grade encrypted flash drive. I inserted the heavy metal device into the secured port of my laptop. I did not hesitate. I initiated a comprehensive mass download mirroring the entire hidden ledger, the phantom transaction logs, the offshore routing numbers, and the specific IP addresses connecting Brandon directly to the stolen funds. The transfer progress bar filled slowly, every megabyte of data representing another nail in the coffin of his impending demise. I sat in the profound silence of my home office, listening to the faint hum of the laptop processor as it compiled the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. The raw physical pain of my surgical recovery had completely vanished entirely, replaced by an overwhelming sense of absolute power. The tears I had cried earlier in the nursery felt like they belonged to a completely different lifetime, to a weak, vulnerable girl who no longer existed. The digital download completed with a soft, satisfying chime. I safely ejected the encrypted flash drive, gripping the cool metal tightly in my palm. This small device was no longer just a digital storage unit. It was the absolute, undeniable key to a federal penitentiary cell. I possessed the exact mechanism required to strip Brandon of his false prestige, destroy his career, and ensure he spent the next 2 decades wearing a government-issued uniform. I locked the flash drive securely inside my biometric wall safe, directly alongside the verified documentation of my personal trust fund and the newly drafted property injunctions. I powered down the secondary laptop, leaving the firm's network completely undisturbed, exactly as I had found it, like a phantom who had never been there. I unbolted my office door and stepped back out into the dark, silent hallway. The war was no longer just a defensive maneuver to protect my child and my home. It was now a targeted offensive strike designed to completely eradicate a criminal syndicate. The air in the hallway felt remarkably crisp, carrying the faint, lingering scent of Brandon's expensive cologne from hours ago. That lingering aroma no longer represented a devastating betrayal. It now served as a sharp, constant reminder of the profound justice I was preparing to deliver. I walked quietly back toward the nursery, my mind meticulously organizing the next devastating phase of my grand retaliation. I was completely ready. The morning sun breached the horizon, casting long shadows across the pristine suburban streets. Inside the sprawling estate, the parasitic occupation evolved from obnoxious disruption into a highly coordinated psychological assault. Patricia spearheaded the morning campaign. She marched into the kitchen, where I was preparing a specialized formula for Lily, and immediately began a relentless barrage of maternal gaslighting. She criticized the temperature of the water, the brand of the bottles, and the dark circles under my exhausted eyes. She heavily implied that my physical weakness was a direct danger to the infant. Keisha flanked her mother, chiming in loudly. They operated with a sickening synergy, feeding off each other to weave a toxic narrative of my absolute incompetence. Their shared goal was entirely transparent. They wanted to systematically dismantle my sanity piece by piece until I genuinely believed I was an unfit mother. I absorbed their malicious attacks with a blank, defeated expression. I allowed my shoulders to slump, my hands to tremble slightly, and my gaze to drop to the marble floor. I played the role of the broken, hysterical woman they desperately needed me to be. I shuffled toward the kitchen island, retrieving a large orange bottle. It was a prescription bottle of heavy post-surgical painkillers. I made a deliberate theatrical display of shaking 2 pills into my palm and swallowing them with a glass of water, right in front of their calculating eyes. I muttered a weak apology about my physical limits, claiming the medication was making me overwhelmingly drowsy. I slowly carried Lily out of the kitchen, leaving the two women exchanging triumphant, knowing glances behind my back. They genuinely believed their psychological warfare had successfully shattered my remaining defenses. I carried Lily into the nursery, securing her comfortably in her automated rocking bassinet. The heavy medication I had swallowed was nothing more than prenatal vitamins, but the illusion of my incapacitation was absolutely necessary for the next phase of my retaliation. I needed to present them with an irresistible opportunity. I walked across the hall to the Grand Master Suite. I intentionally left the heavy oak door completely unlatched, leaving a narrow, inviting gap. I collapsed onto the massive king-sized bed, pulling the thick duvet over my body, and remained perfectly still for 45 minutes. I listened intently as the sounds of the house shifted. Patricia announced she was going outside. She stepped onto the patio to make phone calls. The heavy silence that followed signaled the perfect hunting environment for opportunistic thieves. Once I was certain Patricia was occupied outside, I silently slipped out of the master suite bed and glided back into the nursery, locking the door firmly behind me. I retrieved my smartphone from my pocket and opened a highly secured application. 6 months prior to Lily being born, I had hired a private security contractor to upgrade the estate. I had them discreetly install a comprehensive network of microscopic hidden cameras equipped with ultra-high-definition resolution. These sophisticated cameras featured night vision capabilities and were seamlessly integrated into the crown, molding the smoke detectors and the custom cabinetry. I tapped the screen, activating the live feed for the master suite. The trap was primed. Less than 10 minutes later, the master bedroom door slowly creaked open. Keisha and Jamal slipped into the room, their movements hurried and paranoid. They did not check the bed to confirm I was sleeping. Their absolute greed blinded them to basic caution. They moved with the frantic energy of seasoned scavengers heading straight for the massive walk-in closet to steal. I watched the live feed on my phone screen, zooming in on their faces. The ultra-high-definition cameras captured every bead of sweat on Jamal's forehead and the hungry, desperate gleam in Keisha's eyes. They had clearly planned this exact maneuver, waiting for the perfect moment of perceived vulnerability to strike. They navigated the rows of designer clothing and custom shelving, stopping at the back wall of the closet. Behind a false panel of cedar wood sat my private jewelry safe. It was a heavy, reinforced steel vault, requiring a biometric scan and a complex numerical passcode to open. However, I had anticipated their sheer desperation. I had deliberately disabled the biometric lock the previous night and left the numerical keypad coated with a fine layer of transparent cosmetic powder. Keisha pulled a small ultraviolet flashlight from her pocket, a trick she had undoubtedly learned from her previous questionable endeavors. She illuminated the keypad, revealing the exact 4 numbers I had pressed. Jamal punched in the sequence. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. The interior of the safe was lined with black velvet, displaying a breathtaking collection of wealth. I had intentionally stocked the vault with assets. There were 4 vintage luxury watches, a diamond tennis bracelet, a pair of emerald earrings, and a massive heirloom sapphire ring that had belonged to my late grandmother. The total combined value of the physical assets sitting inside that vault exceeded $150,000. The sheer magnitude of the treasure caused Jamal to physically stagger backward. Keisha gasped, covering her mouth with her hands before a sickening smile stretched across her face. They did not hesitate. They did not display a single ounce of moral conflict or hesitation. Jamal unzipped a large black duffel bag he carried. He had hidden the bag under his oversized jacket. Keisha began grabbing the velvet boxes and the loose watches, indiscriminately tossing the priceless heirlooms into the dark canvas bag. The hidden camera mounted directly above the safe captured the entire felony in brutal, undeniable clarity. The high-grade audio microphone picked up their hushed, frantic whispers. Keisha urged Jamal to hurry, claiming they could pawn the vintage watches at a specialized dealer across state lines and use the massive cash influx to pay off their mounting credit card debts. They were actively confessing to grand larceny and interstate fencing operations. They were plotting federal crimes while standing inside my closet. I sat perfectly still in the nursery rocking chair watching the digital screen with absolute cold detachment. The smartphone application was not just displaying a live feed, it was actively recording the high-definition footage, encoding the video files, and simultaneously uploading the unalterable evidence directly to a secure offshore cloud server. Even if they somehow discovered the hidden cameras and destroyed the physical recording equipment, the footage was already permanently secured in a digital vault they could never access. The upload progress bar on my screen filled steadily onward. It was ensuring their impending incarceration. Jamal zipped the duffel bag shut, securing the stolen fortune. Keisha carefully closed the heavy steel door of the safe, scrambling the keypad numbers and sliding the false cedar panel back into place. They believed they had committed the perfect, flawless crime. They assumed I would remain in a drug-induced slumber for hours, giving them ample time to secure the stolen assets in the trunk of their vehicle. They slunk out of the walk-in closet, moving quickly past the empty king-sized bed and slipping out of the master suite completely undetected. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them. I lowered my smartphone, the screen transitioning to a locked black state. The profound silence of the nursery felt remarkably different now. It was no longer the silence of isolation or despair. It was the heavy, expectant silence that precedes a massive, devastating explosion. The psychological warfare they had attempted to wage against me had completely failed. They wanted to break my mind to steal my property through legal manipulation. Instead, their own inherent greed had driven them to commit a blatant, undeniable felony right in front of a federal surveillance system. The sheer irony of the situation was almost poetic. Patricia had ordered them to push me toward a mental breakdown to secure the estate for Brandon. Keisha and Jamal had weaponized that strategy to execute a massive personal heist, completely abandoning the family conspiracy to line their own pockets. There was absolutely no loyalty among parasites. They were willing to steal from the very woman their brother was attempting to defraud, proving that their entire family structure was built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated selfishness. I stood up from the nursery chair, feeling a powerful surge of absolute vindication. The trap had officially snapped shut, securing the absolute destruction of my sister-in-law and her husband. I now possessed the exact leverage required to send them to a state penitentiary for a very long time. The grand larceny footage was safely locked away, waiting for the perfect moment of maximum devastation to be revealed. I looked down at Lily, her tiny chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. With the physical threat of Keisha and Jamal neutralized by their own criminal stupidity, my focus shifted back to the primary targets remaining in the great game of vengeance. I found my highly vetted private night nurse, Mrs. Higgins, sitting in the corner reading a book under a small reading lamp. I had retained her premium services months ago, completely bypassing my husband and strictly prohibiting my mother-in-law from interfering with her professional duties. Mrs. Higgins offered a reassuring nod as I entered the room. Her calm presence was an absolute guarantee of my daughter's safety. I knew Lily was protected by an ironclad professional who would never allow Patricia or Keisha to step foot inside that nursery. I changed into a sharp-tailored black suit, shedding the loose recovery garments that had served as my camouflage all day. The physical pain of my fresh surgical incision was completely numb now, entirely drowned out by the icy adrenaline pumping relentlessly through my veins. I slipped out the side door, bypassing the guest wing where the parasites were undoubtedly dreaming of their stolen vintage watches. The night air was sharp and biting as I climbed into the driver's seat of my personal heavy-duty SUV. I navigated the empty suburban streets with cold precision, heading straight for the towering illuminated skyscrapers of the downtown financial district. My destination was a highly secluded subterranean VIP lounge, a private establishment exclusively reserved for the city's financial elite and power brokers. I handed my keys to the silent valet, and the heavy, soundproof oak doors sealed behind me, completely cutting off the ambient noise of the outside world. The lounge was dimly lit, smelling richly of aged leather, expensive bourbon, and the quiet arrogance of immense wealth. I walked past the polished mahogany bar, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, and headed toward a private glass-enclosed alcove situated at the very back of the cavernous room. Sitting alone at the heavy oak table was Dominic. He was an imposing, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, radiating the kind of quiet, dangerous power that came from destroying corporate empires before breakfast. He was my husband's most lucrative, untouchable client, an institutional investor known for his absolute ruthlessness. He also happened to be the man married to Vanessa. I slid into the tufted leather booth across from him. He did not smile. His dark eyes studied me with an intense, calculated scrutiny. He had agreed to this midnight meeting based on a single heavily encrypted text message I had sent him an hour prior, promising information regarding a massive, active vulnerability in his primary offshore portfolio. He expected a sterile professional conversation about tax liabilities or corporate restructuring. He had absolutely no idea that I was about to systematically dismantle his entire personal life. I did not waste time with pleasantries or offers of a drink. I maintained unblinking eye contact as I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out two thick, heavily sealed manila folders. I placed them squarely in the center of the polished table. I slid the first folder toward him. Dominic did not immediately reach for it. He stared at the thick envelope, his highly analytical mind calculating the unknown variables. I told him to open it, stating clearly that the contents required zero interpretation. He broke the heavy wax seal and spread the documents across the dark wood. His stoic, unreadable expression fractured almost instantly. I had printed the high-resolution hotel folios, the commercial flight manifests, and the itemized receipts from the Diamond Boutique. I had also included the security footage stills I had pulled from the hotel's lobby cameras by hacking their external-facing server. The crisp images clearly showed my husband wearing his expensive suit, wrapping his arm possessively around Vanessa's waist as they checked into the Waldorf Astoria. Dominic stared at the image of his 28-year-old wife, the woman who had likely kissed him goodbye that very morning, claiming she had a mandatory corporate retreat to attend. I watched his jaw clench tightly, the muscles feathering with deeply suppressed rage. I explained the timeline, detailing exactly how my husband had drained my emergency savings to fund this lavish excursion while I was recovering from emergency surgery. Dominic remained completely silent, his eyes burning holes through the glossy photographs. The air in the private alcove grew suffocatingly dense. He finally looked up, his gaze meeting mine with piercing intensity. The initial shock of the marital betrayal was rapidly morphing into a terrifying cold fury. He asked me why I had brought this directly to him instead of simply filing for a highly publicized lucrative divorce. I did not flinch under his imposing stare. I reached forward and tapped the second manila folder, sliding it directly over the photographs of his cheating wife. I told him that infidelity was merely the opening act of my husband's deception. Dominic ripped open the second folder, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense spreadsheets and complex routing logs I had meticulously compiled from the wealth management firm's hidden servers. I pointed out the fractional diversion tactics, the phantom transactions, and the complex web of offshore shell companies my husband had constructed to siphon money directly from his private equity portfolio. I watched the realization hit the billionaire like a physical blow to the chest. The man he trusted to manage his vast fortunes had not just stolen his wife, he had embezzled over $2 million of his personal capital to fund the very affair staring back at him from the table. The audacity of the theft committed by a mid-level executive against a titan of industry was a professional insult that Dominic would never forgive. I explained the digital money trail with forensic precision. I detailed how my husband was using the stolen funds to buy luxury sports cars, purchase $15,000 diamond necklaces for Vanessa, and secretly bankroll the parasitic family members currently occupying my home. I showed him the exact routing numbers, connecting the stolen corporate funds to his wife's lavish downtown apartment and premium international vacations. My husband was using Dominic's own money to seduce and finance Dominic's own wife. The absolute silence stretching between us was heavier than a concrete vault. Dominic slowly closed the second folder, resting his large hands flat against the mahogany table. The transformation I witnessed was absolute. The betrayed, heartbroken husband was entirely gone, completely replaced by the ruthless billionaire predator who had built his massive empire on the absolute destruction of his enemies. The temperature in the alcove seemed to drop 10 degrees. We sat in the dim light of the VIP lounge, two betrayed spouses staring at each other across a mountain of damning evidence. No tears were shed. No words of hollow comfort were exchanged. We did not need to speak to understand the gravity of the situation or the necessity of our response. We shared a silent, lethal look of mutual understanding that transcended any verbal contract. My husband and Vanessa had arrogantly believed they were completely untouchable, safely hidden away in their luxury New York suite, oblivious to the fact that their respective spouses had just forged an unbreakable, devastating alliance. We agreed on the timeline without a single argument. We would wait. We would let them enjoy their stolen vacation, let them build their false sense of security to its absolute peak. We would allow them to drink expensive champagne and parade around the city, entirely unaware that the ground beneath their feet had completely vanished. We formulated a flawless, synchronized plan to obliterate them the exact moment their return flight touched down on the tarmac. Dominic promised to leverage his immense corporate power and his formidable legal team to ensure the embezzlement charges resulted in a maximum federal prison sentence. He would personally oversee the complete eradication of my husband's professional reputation, guaranteeing he would never work in the financial sector again. In return, I provided Dominic with the undeniable proof he needed to execute a flawless zero-asset divorce against Vanessa, leaving her entirely destitute and blacklisted from the corporate world. We mapped out every single detail, from the freezing of the hotel credit cards to the precise timing of the federal agents waiting at my front door. The trap was perfectly set, the evidence was impenetrable, and our execution would be absolutely merciless. I gathered my empty briefcase, leaving the folders with the billionaire. I walked out of the lounge and into the cold night air, the alliance sealed in stone. The drive back to the estate from my late-night meeting with Dominic was a blur of calculated anticipation. The cold night air whipping through the slightly lowered window felt incredibly refreshing against my face. I slipped back into my home entirely undetected, bypassing the guest wing where the parasitic intruders were sleeping soundly. I managed to sleep for a few solid hours, the deep sleep of a general whose battlefield strategy was perfectly locked into place. Friday morning arrived with a harsh gray light filtering through the towering windows of the grand foyer. It was exactly one day before Brandon and his mistress were scheduled to land. The final pieces of my intricate retaliation needed to be executed flawlessly. I stood in the center of my custom chef's kitchen, preparing a specialized formula bottle for Lily. The silence of the morning was violently shattered by heavy footsteps echoing across the marble entryway. Patricia marched into the kitchen with the aggressive, entitled stride of an invading conqueror. She was dressed impeccably, her posture rigid with an overwhelming sense of self-importance. Keisha and Jamal trailed closely behind her, their faces plastered with matching expressions of arrogant triumph. They moved in perfect synchronization, a unified front of pure toxicity. Patricia did not utter a single word of greeting. She stepped directly up to the massive granite island and violently slammed a thick stack of legal-looking documents onto the stone surface. The sharp cracking sound echoed sharply through the cavernous kitchen, intended to induce immediate fear. I kept my face entirely neutral, carefully setting the baby bottle down before looking at the papers. Printed in bold, menacing black ink across the top of the first page was a formal notice of immediate eviction. I stared at the fraudulent document, utilizing every ounce of my forensic training to prevent a genuine smile from breaking across my face. The paperwork was a pathetic, legally baseless forgery. It cited fabricated claims of severe mental instability and gross property negligence, bearing a completely fake seal that would never hold up in a courtroom. It was a scare tactic, a desperate psychological blow designed to force me out before Brandon returned. Patricia leaned forward, pressing her manicured hands flat against the granite, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. She ordered me to pack my belongings and vacate the premises immediately. She venomously declared that my supposed postpartum hysteria made me a severe danger to the household, and that her son could no longer tolerate living with an unstable wife. Keisha stepped up beside her mother, crossing her arms over her chest with a cruel smirk. Keisha loudly proclaimed that if I dared to cause a scene, Jamal would contact Child Protective Services. She threatened to have Lily permanently removed from my custody, citing my fabricated mental breakdown as undeniable proof of my incompetence. Jamal shifted his weight, attempting to look physically intimidating, puffing out his chest to reinforce his wife's vile threat. They genuinely believed they had me completely trapped. The sheer audacity of their conspiracy required an equally dramatic response. I needed them to believe they had successfully executed their master plan, that they had thoroughly destroyed my will to fight. I drew a shaky breath, forcing my eyes to widen in manufactured terror. I let my shoulders slump forward, abandoning my confident posture. I unleashed a broken, desperate sob, letting my knees buckle beneath me. I collapsed onto the cold marble floor of the kitchen, burying my face in my trembling hands. I ensured my shoulders shook violently, projecting the exact image of a devastated, defeated woman whose entire world had just been forcibly ripped away. Through my parted fingers, I watched their reactions. Patricia looked down at my weeping form with absolute unmasked disgust, repulsed by my supposed weakness, yet deeply satisfied by her overwhelming victory. Keisha let out a sharp, victorious laugh, nudging Jamal playfully as if they had just won a grand prize. I raised my tear-stained face, looking up at Patricia with pleading eyes. I begged her to reconsider, letting my voice crack with perfectly tuned desperation. I cried out that I had absolutely nowhere else to go, that my surgical incision was still causing me immense pain, and that I could not possibly care for a newborn infant out on the street. Patricia simply scoffed, stepping back as if my proximity might infect her with failure. She stated that my living arrangements were no longer her concern. She informed me that Brandon had already authorized this action, and the luxury mansion was now officially being prepared for his fresh start. She was blatantly paving the way for Vanessa to walk through the front door tomorrow afternoon. I continued to weep, clutching the edge of the kitchen island, begging for just a tiny fraction of time to gather my most basic necessities. Patricia checked her expensive watch, feigning annoyance at the inconvenience of my suffering. She sharply granted me exactly 1 hour to pack a single bag and remove myself from the property, threatening physical removal by local authorities if I delayed. I meekly nodded, wiping my face, and slowly pulled myself up from the floor. I kept my gaze firmly directed at the ground, playing the thoroughly conquered victim to absolute perfection. I shuffled past them, listening to their triumphant whispers as I made my way toward the grand staircase. I slowly ascended the stairs, dragging my feet heavily against the carpet. The moment I crossed the threshold into the master suite and closed the heavy door, the tears instantly dried. The trembling ceased entirely. I walked smoothly to my walk-in closet, retrieving a single small overnight bag. I packed only the absolute essentials for Lily and a few changes of clothing for myself. I did not touch the designer garments, expensive electronics, or the valuable items scattered around the room. A defeated woman facing homelessness would not carefully pack luxury goods. She would grab what she needed to survive and flee in terror. I zipped the small bag shut, my expression mirroring the cold stone of a mountain. Downstairs, the volume of their celebration grew increasingly louder. They were absolutely thrilled with their performance, convinced they had successfully secured a multi-million-dollar estate for their golden boy and his new mistress without facing a single legal hurdle. Through the thick floorboards, I heard Keisha loudly declare that they needed to go out and celebrate their massive victory properly. She eagerly suggested booking a reservation at an upscale steakhouse downtown, undoubtedly planning to fund the lavish meal using the stolen money Brandon had funneled into Jamal's account. Patricia heartily agreed, stating they deserved a premium lunch after dealing with such a miserable morning. I listened as they bustled around the entryway, grabbing their coats and making plans for the rest of the day. They did not even bother to check if I was actually packing or preparing to leave. Their arrogance was so profound they assumed my compliance was absolute. I sat on the large bed in the master suite, the small overnight bag resting quietly beside my feet. I waited patiently, tracking the sounds of their departure. The front door swung open, followed by the boastful voices of Keisha and Jamal discussing what cuts of meat they planned to order. Patricia's voice ordered them to hurry, complaining about the chilly morning air. The heavy oak doors finally slammed shut, the definitive sound echoing through the cavernous house. I walked to the bedroom window, peering through the slight gap in the heavy velvet curtains. I watched Jamal climb into the driver's seat, Patricia taking the passenger side and Keisha sliding into the back. The car reversed out of the long paved driveway, turning onto the pristine suburban street before speeding away toward the city. They had left me completely alone in the sprawling mansion, fully expecting me to meekly walk out into the cold with my infant and my single bag, abandoning my home to their invading forces. They genuinely believed I was currently standing in the foyer, weeping uncontrollably, preparing to surrender my life to their conspiracy. The utter foolishness of their assumption fueled the dark, powerful energy surging through my veins. The house was perfectly silent, a blank canvas awaiting my final, devastating stroke of genius. The victim mentality they so desperately wanted to impose upon me had evaporated into the morning air. I turned away from the window, scanning the exquisitely furnished room that I had meticulously designed and paid for with my own trust fund. The time for acting was officially over. The final phase of my physical retaliation was about to commence, and I would leave them with nothing. Every single piece of leverage they thought they possessed was completely gone. The game was no longer about simple survival or securing a tactical defensive perimeter. It was about absolute, total eradication. I reached for my smartphone, ready to execute the masterstroke. The heavy oak door clicked shut with a resounding thud, instantly plunging the massive entryway into a profound, expectant silence. I stood perfectly still in the center of the grand foyer, my breathing shallow, meticulously tracking the muffled sounds of the parasitic invader's departure through the thick imported floorboards. The aggressive, obnoxious revving of Jamal's oversized engine vibrated slightly through the structural walls of the estate, followed quickly by the harsh crunch of gravel as his heavy vehicle backed out of my long paved driveway. I moved swiftly and silently to the towering front window, parting the heavy custom velvet curtains just a fraction of an inch. I watched their vehicle turn sharply onto the pristine suburban street, accelerating aggressively toward the city limits. They were enthusiastically heading to a premium upscale steakhouse to celebrate their perceived magnificent victory, actively planning to spend the stolen corporate funds my husband had illegally funneled into their personal accounts. They genuinely believed they had successfully permanently evicted a fragile, weeping, completely broken mother, leaving her utterly destitute and terrified. The absolute precise second their rear bumper disappeared entirely around the corner, my posture transformed with violent, calculated efficiency. The manufactured, pathetic trembling in my hands ceased immediately. The slumped, defeated slouch I had carefully maintained for the past 24 hours evaporated into the morning air, completely replaced by a spine of absolute, unyielding steel. I was no longer a weeping victim, cowering in the shadows of my own home. I was the ruthless, highly analytical architect of their impending spectacular destruction. I pulled my heavily encrypted smartphone from the deep pocket of my oversized recovery cardigan. I did not shed a single solitary tear. The designated time for emotional processing and postpartum despair had officially expired, completely replaced by a cold, mechanical, tactical focus. I bypassed my standard contact list and manually dialed a highly specific unlisted local number. It was the direct priority line to a premium discreet commercial relocation firm I had thoroughly vetted and securely retained just hours after my clandestine late-night meeting with Dominic. The specialized company operated with military precision, focusing on rapid, high-value asset extraction for elite clients undergoing hostile corporate liquidations or high-stakes asset division. I gave the stern dispatcher a single prearranged alphanumeric authorization code, officially confirming that the target property was entirely clear of all hostile occupants. The operator responded efficiently, assuring me the massive deployment was already in active motion. I ended the call and slipped the sleek phone back into my pocket. A sharp, powerful wave of adrenaline flooded my system, entirely masking the dull, lingering physical ache of my recent surgical recovery. I walked purposefully down the grand, sweeping staircase, my bare feet making absolutely zero sound against the plush, expensive runner. I moved fluidly through the opulent living room, committing the luxurious layout to memory one final detached time. I had personally purchased every single piece of custom furniture, every imported textile, and every piece of original artwork, utilizing my own premarital trust fund. Brandon had merely occupied the opulent space, treating my hard-earned financial achievements as his own personal unearned kingdom. He had confidently planned to casually move his junior assistant into my deeply personal sanctuary the very moment I was fraudulently driven out. That arrogant, parasitic fantasy was about to be violently, permanently eradicated from reality. Exactly 20 minutes after my encrypted phone call, the heavy rumbling sound of massive diesel engines shattered the quiet, predictable tranquility of the upscale neighborhood. I opened the front door and stepped confidently onto the sprawling porch. A massive, highly coordinated fleet of 5 commercial moving trucks swarmed the property, their harsh air brakes hissing sharply as they lined up flawlessly along the expansive driveway and the adjacent residential street. A dedicated team of 20 professional movers, dressed in matching dark, heavy-duty uniforms, poured out of the commercial vehicles with stunning military precision. The seasoned foreman, a broad-shouldered man holding a rugged digital clipboard, approached the porch for my final, ultimate authorization. I granted his crew full, unrestricted access to the entire multi-million-dollar estate, instructing him strictly to execute a total comprehensive asset extraction. I wanted the massive mansion stripped entirely down to the bare, painted drywall. I wanted absolutely nothing left behind that could provide a single ounce of comfort, utility, or financial value to the federal criminal returning tomorrow afternoon. The crew surged into the house like an incredibly efficient, synchronized mechanical swarm. They did not pack boxes with sentimental, lingering care. They executed a ruthless, systematic deconstruction of my former life. I stood observing near the kitchen island, holding my sleeping infant daughter securely in a specialized ergonomic carrier across my chest, silently orchestrating the domestic demolition. 4 heavily muscled men tackled the grand living room first. They hoisted the massive custom-ordered velvet sofas onto their broad shoulders, wrapping them tightly in thick, protective industrial canvas, before marching them directly out the front door. The imported hand-carved mahogany dining set, the very table where the parasites had just arrogantly enjoyed their stolen feast, was swiftly dismantled, wrapped, and carried away into the gaping maws of the waiting trucks. The crew stripped the towering walls entirely bare, carefully wrapping my expensive collection of original abstract artwork and unscrewing the heavy brass mounting brackets from the drywall. The vibrant, opulent personality of the magnificent house was rapidly draining away, leaving behind stark, empty expanses of pale, unblemished paint. I instructed a specialized electrical team to target the luxury fixtures. They set up tall aluminum ladders and systematically unscrewed the cascading imported crystal chandeliers from the vaulted ceilings, capping the exposed electrical wires with clinical detached precision. They expertly unhooked the heavy custom velvet window treatments, letting the harsh, unfiltered morning light flood aggressively into the increasingly cavernous space. The warm, inviting atmosphere of the estate evaporated completely instantly, replaced by a cold, sterile, blinding glare. I directed the extraction crew toward the custom chef's kitchen. They did not simply empty the expansive pantry and the deep custom cabinets. They actively removed the high-end freestanding luxury appliances. The massive commercial-grade espresso machine, the imported temperature-controlled wine cooler, and the smart double-door refrigerator were forcefully disconnected, strapped to heavy-duty dollies, and rolled down the paved driveway. I watched the gaping, dark holes materialize in my beautiful white cabinetry, where the premium appliances used to reside. Brandon had undoubtedly planned to pour himself a glass of stolen vintage wine from that exact cooler tomorrow afternoon. Instead, he would find a hollow, dusty, disconnected cavity. The systematic erasure moved relentlessly to the second floor. I guided the movers directly into the master suite, the specific room where Brandon had meticulously applied his expensive designer cologne before abandoning his crying newborn daughter. The crew rapidly dismantled the massive king-sized bed frame, stripping the premium mattress and the imported silk sheets. They completely emptied the expansive walk-in closets, packing away every single designer suit luxury shoe, an expensive accessory that Brandon had casually purchased using Dominic's embezzled institutional funds. I did not leave him a single solitary thread of his fabricated wealthy identity. Everything was meticulously cataloged, boxed, and loaded into the waiting commercial trucks, destined for a highly secure climate-controlled storage facility located entirely outside the state's immediate jurisdiction. Over the course of 4 intense, uninterrupted hours, the multi-million-dollar mansion was effectively brutally gutted. The rhythmic, heavy thumping of industrial work boots and the sharp, echoing commands of the moving foreman bounced loudly off the newly bared walls. The acoustic profile of the grand estate completely transformed. Without the thick Persian rugs, the heavy luxury furniture, and the expansive custom drapery to absorb the ambient sound, every single footstep amplified into a harsh, hollow, terrifying echo. The house suddenly felt massive, cavernous, and utterly devoid of human life. It was no longer a warm, welcoming home. It was a barren, empty, echoing shell. The foreman approached me with his digital clipboard, formally signaling that the extraction operation was entirely complete. I walked slowly through the ground floor, my deliberate footsteps echoing sharply against the uncovered, polished hardwood. I meticulously inspected the sprawling living room, the vast dining area, and the gutted kitchen. Absolutely nothing remained. They had even removed the decorative vanity mirrors from the guest bathrooms and the expensive plush towels from the linen closets. If Patricia, Keisha, and Jamal attempted to prematurely return and violently reclaim their stolen territory, they would not find a single wooden chair to sit on or a functional sink to secure a drop of water. I thanked the exhausted moving crew and officially authorized their immediate departure. The massive diesel engines roared to life in unison, the impressive fleet of trucks slowly pulling out of the driveway and disappearing down the suburban street, carrying the entire physical manifestation of my former life away with them into the ether. I stood completely alone in the center of the vast, echoing entryway. The sheer magnitude of the sudden emptiness was breathtakingly powerful. I looked down at Lily, who was slowly waking up and blinking against the harsh, unfiltered sunlight streaming through the bare, uncovered windows. I gently adjusted her soft knit blanket, ensuring she was completely comfortable and physically secure in her protective carrier. I walked slowly toward the heavy oak front door. I did not lock the deadbolt. I did not even pull the heavy wood shut. I pushed the massive front door wide open, forcing it back until its heavy brass hinges locked firmly into place. I wanted the cold, biting, unforgiving wind to sweep freely through the cavernous, empty rooms. I wanted Brandon to clearly see the gaping, welcoming, terrifying void the absolute second his rideshare pulled up to the suburban curb tomorrow afternoon. I wanted the open door to serve as a glaring, undeniable physical symbol of his complete and total loss of absolute control. I stepped off the grand porch and walked steadily to my personal heavy-duty SUV, which had been parked strategically down the street to avoid the massive moving trucks. I carefully secured Lily into her rear-facing car seat, double-checking the complex safety harnesses with meticulous maternal care. I climbed gracefully into the driver's seat and smoothly started the powerful engine. I took one final lingering, deeply satisfying look at the barren, echoing shell of the multi-million-dollar estate. The open front door stood proudly, like a dark, gaping mouth, waiting patiently to swallow the arrogant, cheating, embezzling criminal completely whole. I shifted the vehicle into gear and drove away, a cold, victorious smile finally gracing my lips, leaving the empty, echoing trap perfectly primed for tomorrow's spectacular devastation. From the pristine safety of my newly secured high-rise penthouse across the city, I opened the encrypted surveillance application on my tablet. I had deliberately left one single microscopic camera active, discreetly mounted inside the brass porch sconce of the estate, specifically to witness this exact inevitable moment. The high-definition live feed loaded instantly, broadcasting the quiet suburban street in brilliant clarity. It was exactly 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. The bright, unforgiving sunlight illuminated the long paved driveway where a standard, slightly dented economy rideshare vehicle abruptly pulled up to the curb. It was a jarringly pedestrian arrival for a man who fancied himself a titan of the financial sector. The rear doors of the budget sedan swung open, and Brandon stepped out onto the pavement. He did not look like the impeccably groomed, arrogant executive who had abandoned his bleeding wife and crying newborn just over a week ago. He looked utterly exhausted, thoroughly disheveled, and radiating a toxic, barely contained rage. The morning had clearly been an absolute, unmitigated disaster for him. I knew exactly what had transpired at the Waldorf Astoria because I had orchestrated every single excruciating second of it. When Brandon confidently strolled up to the opulent front desk to process his final checkout payment, the automated trap I embedded in his financial routing had flawlessly triggered. The system instantly declined his premium black credit card. He undoubtedly attempted to use his secondary cards, only to find every single account frozen, locked, and completely inaccessible. The sheer public humiliation of standing in the lobby of one of the most exclusive hotels in the world, unable to cover a massive luxury bill, must have been suffocating. He had been forced to stand aside while Vanessa, his 28-year-old junior assistant, frantically drained her own meager personal checking account to cover the damages and secure 2 cheap last-minute economy tickets back home. Vanessa stepped out of the rideshare vehicle behind him, struggling to pull her own luggage from the trunk. The glamorous, carefree illusion of her illicit romantic getaway had violently evaporated. She looked pale, anxious, and deeply uncomfortable. She had foolishly believed she was running away with a limitlessly wealthy executive, a man capable of showering her with $15,000 diamond necklaces and luxury suites. Instead, she had spent her morning paying his exorbitant hotel tabs and flying completely cramped in a budget airline seat. Brandon aggressively snatched his designer Toomey suitcase from the driver, slamming the trunk shut with unnecessary force. He did not offer a tip. He did not even acknowledge the driver. He simply grabbed Vanessa by the hand, his grip tight and commanding, desperate to regain the absolute control he felt slipping through his fingers. Watching them through the digital screen, I observed the fascinating psychological mechanics of a severe narcissist desperately attempting to repair a fractured ego. Brandon physically straightened his posture, rolling his stiff shoulders and adjusting the collar of his wrinkled designer shirt. He was actively compartmentalizing the catastrophic morning, burying the intense public humiliation beneath layers of profound delusion. He forcefully pushed the credit card failure out of his mind, likely convincing himself it was nothing more than a temporary banking glitch. A minor administrative error he would aggressively rectify the moment he sat down at his computer. He needed to pivot his attention toward a guaranteed victory. He needed to show Vanessa the tangible, undeniable proof of his immense wealth and unyielding power. He turned his gaze toward the sprawling multi-million-dollar estate. From the exterior, the massive property still projected an aura of absolute dominance and elite status. The manicured lawns were perfectly trimmed, the grand architectural pillars stood tall and imposing, and the expansive stone facade looked entirely untouched. Brandon genuinely believed that while he was away, Patricia, Keisha, and Jamal had successfully executed their vile psychological warfare campaign. He fully assumed that my spirit had been completely broken, that I had been reduced to a weeping, hysterical failure, and that I had meekly surrendered the property to escape their coordinated torment. He thought the heavy lifting had been outsourced and completed, leaving the majestic kingdom entirely vacant and waiting for his triumphant return. I watched him speak to Vanessa, his arrogant, confident demeanor rapidly returning with every step they took up the driveway. Although the exterior camera did not capture audio, his exaggerated body language painted a crystal-clear picture of his dialogue. He was undoubtedly hyping up the opulent interior of the mansion. He was promising her a life of unimaginable luxury, bragging about the custom velvet sofas, the imported mahogany dining set, the commercial-grade chef's kitchen, and the massive walk-in closets where she could store the expensive designer wardrobes he planned to buy her. He was painting a vivid, detailed masterpiece of their new life together, actively stepping over the imaginary ashes of his destroyed marriage to elevate his mistress to the status of a queen. Vanessa's anxious expression slowly began to soften, entirely seduced by the grandiose promises of extreme wealth. She looked up at the towering facade of the estate, her eyes widening with greedy anticipation. This was the exact prize she had compromised her morals to obtain. She believed the uncomfortable, humiliating morning at the hotel was merely a small bump in the road, a minor inconvenience paving the way to a lifetime of absolute financial security and high society privilege. She leaned into Brandon, wrapping her arm around his waist, validating his damaged ego and reinforcing his delusion of absolute supremacy. They walked up the grand stone steps of the front porch in perfect toxic synchronization, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality waiting just inches away. As they reached the top of the stairs, Brandon confidently reached into his pocket to retrieve his heavy brass house key. However, his hand abruptly paused. He noticed the heavy oak front door was not firmly shut. It was pushed ajar, the heavy metal hinges locked into place, leaving a wide, gaping dark opening into the main foyer. A brief flicker of confusion crossed his sharp features, followed instantly by a smirk of profound, arrogant satisfaction. In his twisted, incredibly arrogant mind, the open door was the ultimate confirmation of his family's glorious victory. He likely assumed Patricia had deliberately left the door open to air out the house after my pathetic rushed departure. He believed the open threshold was a welcoming gesture, a red carpet rolled out to invite him back into his newly conquered, completely liberated territory. I leaned closer to my tablet, my heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm of pure, unadulterated vindication. The trap was perfectly primed. The devastating collision between his grandiose fantasy and my orchestrated reality was only seconds away. He took a deep theatrical breath of the suburban air, puffing out his chest to maximum capacity. He turned to Vanessa, flashing her a brilliant, charismatic smile, preparing to deliver his grand, welcoming monologue. He firmly grasped the brass handle of the heavy oak door and forcefully pushed it completely open, stepping proudly across the threshold and pulling his designer Toomey suitcase behind him. His confident, commanding stride violently faltered the absolute instant his expensive Italian leather shoes touched the bare, uncovered hardwood floor. He stopped dead in his tracks, freezing completely solid, like a man who had just stepped directly onto a live landmine. The designer's suitcase slipped from his suddenly numb fingers. It hit the naked floorboards with a deafening, sharp, echoing crack that reverberated violently through the vast, empty cavern of the house. The grand, welcoming speech he had prepared instantly died in his throat, completely dissolving into a dry, choking gasp of pure, unfiltered shock. He stepped fully into the living room, his eyes darting frantically in every conceivable direction. The entire house was completely brutally stripped. The magnificent, vibrant, opulent home he had bragged about just moments ago no longer existed. The custom velvet sofas were gone. The imported hand-carved dining set had vanished. The towering walls were entirely bare, stripped of every single piece of original abstract artwork. The heavy, imported crystal chandeliers had been removed from the vaulted ceilings, leaving only capped, exposed electrical wires dangling pathetically in the harsh, unfiltered light. The expensive custom window treatments were missing, allowing the blinding afternoon sun to cast long, harsh shadows across the barren, dusty floorboards. There was not a single piece of furniture. There was not a single Persian rug to absorb the sound. There was not a single light bulb remaining in the fixtures. The once majestic, multi-million-dollar estate had been reduced to a hollow, cavernous, echoing shell. The sheer magnitude of the sudden, aggressive emptiness was physically staggering. It was a complete, systematic, flawless eradication of his entire fabricated identity. Every single physical marker of his wealth, his status, and his perceived superiority had been violently ripped away, leaving him standing in a vast, terrifying void. I watched his face contort in pure, unadulterated horror. The color drained entirely from his sharp features, leaving him looking sickly and pale. The immense psychological shock forcefully shattered the thick layers of his narcissistic delusion. The realization hit him with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. The declined premium credit cards at the hotel were not a random banking glitch. The open front door was not a welcoming gesture from his triumphant mother. The empty, echoing space surrounding him was a highly calculated, ruthlessly executed message. The weak, crying postpartum victim he thought he had successfully manipulated and conquered had actually outmaneuvered him on every single conceivable level. Vanessa stepped cautiously into the empty foyer behind him, her own eyes widening in sheer, terrified confusion. She looked around the barren, dusty walls, desperately searching for the limitless luxury she had been promised. The billionaire lifestyle she had sacrificed her marriage to obtain had instantly evaporated into thin air, leaving her standing in a cold, empty box. She looked at Brandon, seeking reassurance, demanding an explanation for the desolate landscape surrounding them. But Brandon could not speak. His mouth opened and closed silently, his breath coming in short, erratic, panic-stricken gasps. The total loss of absolute control physically paralyzed him. He realized in that agonizing, echoing moment that he possessed absolutely nothing. He had no furniture, no funds, no leverage, and no power. The magnificent kingdom he thought he ruled had been flawlessly pulled right out from under his feet. He was a king without a castle, standing completely destitute in the ruins of his own unparalleled arrogance. As he stared blankly at the bare drywall, the terrifying reality of his absolute destruction finally settled over him, perfectly, setting the stage for the final lethal blow that was currently waiting for him in the shadows. The suffocating silence of the gutted living room pressed inward with a heavy, unyielding physical weight. Brandon stood entirely paralyzed in the center of the bare hardwood floor, his expensive Italian leather shoes rooted to the exact spot where his grandiose delusions had just violently shattered. The sharp, echoing crack of his dropped designer suitcase still seemed to reverberate off the naked drywall, a harsh acoustic reminder of his sudden, absolute destitution. His chest heaved rapidly, pulling in shallow, ragged breaths of the dusty, stale air. He frantically scanned the vast, empty cavern of the ground floor, his mind desperately struggling to process the impossible visual information. He blinked rapidly, aggressively trying to clear what he genuinely believed must be an aggressive, stress-induced hallucination. The towering custom windows, previously adorned with imported velvet treatments, now allowed the blinding afternoon sunlight to cast long, mocking shadows across the barren landscape of his former kingdom. Beside him, Vanessa trembled visibly, her manicured hands clutching the strap of her oversized luxury handbag, like a fragile lifeline. She stepped cautiously around the abandoned luggage, her high heels clicking loudly against the uncovered floorboards. Her dark eyes darted nervously toward the empty kitchen, where the gaping dark cavities of the removed appliances stared back at them like hollow sockets. She looked at the man she had sacrificed her marriage to follow, silently demanding the life of unparalleled wealth and comfort he had so arrogantly promised her during their illicit stay at the Waldorf Astoria. Brandon could not meet her gaze. The overwhelming psychological shock completely severed his connection to his own body, leaving him physically trapped within a rapidly collapsing reality. The arrogant swagger of a high-powered wealth management executive evaporated into the thin, dusty air, leaving behind nothing more than a terrified, exposed fraud holding a useless brass key. The profound stillness of the empty estate was abruptly, violently fractured. From the deep shadows of the long hallway leading toward the master suite, 3 distinct beams of high-intensity tactical light suddenly pierced the gloom. The blinding white LED beams sliced through the floating dust motes, aggressively sweeping across the bare walls before locking directly onto Brandon's pale, sweating face. He flinched violently, throwing his arms up to shield his sensitive eyes from the searing glare. Vanessa let out a sharp, terrified gasp, stumbling backward and nearly losing her footing on the slick hardwood floor. The heavy, synchronized sound of tactical boots advancing down the hallway echoed with a terrifying rhythmic precision, completely shattering any lingering hope that this was a simple misunderstanding. Brandon lowered his trembling arms, squinting desperately into the blinding halo of the tactical lights. He fully expected to see a crew of opportunistic burglars, or perhaps a heavily armed private security team dispatched by his furious mother. Instead, as the intruder stepped smoothly out of the long corridor and into the sunlit expanse of the barren living room, the true nature of his catastrophic downfall materialized in the flesh. Emerging from the center of the blinding glare, radiating an aura of absolute predatory dominance, was Dominic. The billionaire chief executive officer, the most lucrative and ruthless institutional investor in Brandon's entire corporate portfolio, stood right in the middle of the gutted suburban house. He was flanked on either side by two towering, stern-faced federal agents, wearing dark, tactical windbreakers with stark yellow lettering boldly spelling out their elite government affiliation. The blood instantly drained from Brandon's sharp features, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. The sheer impossibility of the billionaire standing inside his dismantled home, flanked by federal law enforcement, caused his knees to physically buckle. He swayed heavily, grasping desperately at the empty air for a piece of custom furniture that no longer existed. He recognized the federal agents, immediately understanding with absolute terrifying clarity that his meticulously hidden offshore accounts and phantom ledgers had been completely exposed. The delayed credit card decline at the luxury hotel suddenly made perfect, devastating sense. It was never a banking glitch. It was the calculated opening maneuver of a highly orchestrated federal takedown. Dominic did not break his imposing stride. He moved across the bare floorboards with the terrifying measured grace of an apex predator closing in on a trapped wounded animal. His dark tailored suit contrasted sharply against the stark white walls of the empty room. He carried a massive thick black binder in his right hand, the heavy spine bulging with hundreds of densely printed pages. Brandon opened his mouth, desperately attempting to formulate a groveling defense, a fabricated excuse, or a pathetic plea for professional mercy, but his vocal cords completely paralyzed. The presence of the billionaire, projecting an atmosphere of cold, unforgiving fury, entirely suffocated any possibility of negotiation. Without breaking his piercing, lethal eye contact, Dominic raised his right arm and violently hurled the massive binder directly at Brandon's chest. The heavy compilation of financial evidence struck the disgraced executive with the force of a physical blow, knocking the remaining breath from his lungs. The thick metal rings of the binder snapped open upon impact with his torso. Brandon stumbled backward, clutching his ribs as the heavy object crashed onto the hardwood floor. A cascading waterfall of highly sensitive financial documents exploded outward, fluttering through the air and carpeting the dusty floorboards in a sea of undeniable guilt. The scattered papers painted a vivid, high-definition portrait of grand corporate theft. Printed across the bright white pages were the exact offshore routing numbers, the specific digital footprints of the fractional skimming algorithms, and the heavily highlighted wire transfers connecting Dominic's private equity portfolio directly to Brandon's ghost entities. Spread across the floor, right at Brandon's trembling feet, were the explicit itemized receipts for luxury sports cars, expensive downtown apartment leases, and premium diamond jewelry. The entire complex web of his $2 million embezzlement scheme lay exposed in the harsh afternoon sunlight, completely destroying any maintaining illusion of his professional innocence. Dominic stepped forward, looming over the broken executive, silently projecting the absolute permanent destruction of Brandon's entire corporate existence and personal freedom. Vanessa, who had backed herself entirely into the corner of the empty foyer, finally recognized the towering billionaire standing in the room. The color vanished from her face as her eyes locked onto her incredibly powerful husband. She realized with crushing, sickening certainty that her secret romantic getaway with a wealthy vice president was not a secret at all. She had blindly walked directly into a perfectly coordinated lethal trap designed by the very man she had betrayed. She dropped her luxury handbag, letting it spill onto the floor, and took a desperate, trembling step toward Dominic. Her posture crumbled into a pathetic display of submission, raising her hands in a futile physical gesture of begging. She frantically attempted to bridge the distance, seeking any shred of marital mercy or emotional leniency from the ruthless executive she had humiliated. Dominic slowly turned his head, shifting his cold, dark gaze away from the embezzler and locking it entirely onto his cheating wife. His expression contained absolutely zero trace of sorrow, heartbreak, or lingering affection. He looked at Vanessa with the profound, detached disgust one might reserve for a common parasite. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and smoothly withdrew a single crisp document. He did not extend his hand to offer it to her. He did not engage in any form of physical contact. He simply held the paper out and let it drop, allowing the document to flutter lazily to the floor, landing directly on the tips of her designer shoes. The document was a fully expedited signed zero-asset divorce decree, backed by an ironclad prenuptial agreement that completely stripped her of every single marital asset. The single sheet of paper instantly vaporized her luxury downtown apartment, her access to premium credit accounts, and her entire fabricated identity as a wealthy elite socialite. Dominic physically turned his back on her entirely, completely severing her from his vast empire without uttering a single syllable. He effectively reduced her to a destitute, homeless participant in a federal fraud case, leaving her standing alone with absolutely nothing to her name but a single piece of cheap luggage. The two federal agents moved forward, executing their duties with synchronized, lethal efficiency. They stepped over the scattered embezzlement documents and aggressively closed the distance between themselves and the paralyzed vice president. Brandon weakly attempted to raise his hands in a pathetic defensive gesture, but the agents swiftly overpowered him. One agent grabbed his right arm, twisting it firmly behind his back with practiced authoritative force, while the second agent secured his left side. The physical reality of the arrest finally shattered the last remaining fragments of his arrogant delusion. The agents verbally outlined the catastrophic severity of his current situation, officially citing the specific warrants for state-level corporate embezzlement and grand wire fraud involving sums exceeding $2 million. They expertly secured his wrists, pulling a heavy set of steel handcuffs from their tactical belts. The loud, sharp metallic click of the restraints locking tightly around his wrists echoed violently through the cavernous, empty house, finalizing his total, absolute loss of control. The cold metal biting into his skin served as the ultimate physical manifestation of his spectacular downfall. Brandon collapsed internally, his shoulders slumping heavily as the federal agents forcibly marched him away from the scattered evidence of his crimes. He was forcefully guided across the bare floorboards, leaving behind the empty shell of a mansion he had never truly owned and the destitute mistress he could no longer afford. He was violently shoved toward the open front door, a broken, exposed criminal marching directly into the harsh, unforgiving afternoon sunlight, completely unaware that his audience of destruction was about to exponentially multiply. As the two stern federal agents frog-marched the entirely disgraced wealth management executive down the wide front porch steps of the completely hollowed estate, a sleek, black luxury SUV suddenly turned sharply onto the quiet suburban street. The vehicle aggressively accelerated up the driveway, its tires crunching loudly against the pristine gravel. It was the unmistakable arrival of Patricia, Keisha, and Jamal. They were returning from their extravagant celebratory lunch at an upscale downtown steakhouse, entirely intoxicated by their completely fabricated victory and operating under the absolute arrogant delusion that they had successfully conquered my multi-million-dollar kingdom. Through the windshield, I saw Keisha waving an imported bottle of premium champagne, ready to eagerly pop the cork the very moment they stepped inside the luxurious mansion they foolishly believed was now entirely theirs to continuously exploit. Jamal threw the heavy SUV into park right behind the unmarked federal vehicles. The trio threw open the doors, faces plastered with arrogant smiles, fully expecting to find a weeping, defeated woman dragging an overnight bag down the driveway. Instead, their mocking laughter violently died in their throats. The champagne bottle slipped from Keisha's manicured fingers, hitting the paved driveway with a sharp, echoing shatter, sending expensive foam spraying across the asphalt. Their arrogant grins instantly melted into sheer panic at the terrifying sight of federal windbreakers and the cold glint of steel handcuffs locked tightly around Brandon's wrists. Patricia's pristine facade crumbled into a mask of pure terror. She took one look at her golden child being restrained by federal law enforcement and immediately attempted to retreat. Jamal frantically grabbed the door handle of his SUV, trying to initiate a rapid escape. Before he could turn the ignition, the sharp wail of a police siren shattered the suburban quiet. Two local police cruisers aggressively swerved into the driveway, their flashing red and blue lights painting the lawns in a frantic glow. The cruisers parked at a harsh angle, completely barricading the heavy SUV. They were perfectly, hopelessly trapped. From the tinted back seat of an unmarked vehicle parked discreetly across the street, I slowly pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the crisp afternoon air. I did not look like the broken, hysterical postpartum victim they had cruelly attempted to manufacture. I radiated unbothered, absolute elegance, dressed impeccably in a sharp designer suit that perfectly masked my surgical recovery. My posture was flawless, my expression composed of cold, terrifying granite. I walked steadily across the pavement, the click of my heels cutting through the chaotic noise. Patricia, Keisha, and Jamal stared at me as if looking at a ghost, their eyes wide with paralyzing shock as they realized the woman they thought they destroyed was actually pulling every string. I stopped a few feet away from their barricaded vehicle, raising a sleek, high-definition tablet in my right hand. Without uttering a single syllable, I tapped the glowing screen, turning the display outward for the entire toxic syndicate to see. Playing in brilliant, crystal-clear 4K resolution was the undeniable, perfectly captured footage of Keisha and Jamal ransacking my master suite walk-in closet. The hidden camera flawlessly displayed them deciphering the cosmetic powder on the keypad, pulling open the heavy steel safe and greedily shoving $150,000 worth of my vintage watches and heirlooms into their duffel bag. The blood drained from Keisha's face, leaving her a sickly ashen color as she stared at her own criminal actions, broadcasting in undeniable clarity. Jamal took a stumbling step backward, raising his hands in a pathetic defensive gesture as local police officers moved swiftly up the driveway. The commanding officer produced a thick stack of expedited warrants, his voice booming across the pavement as he read the devastating charges aloud. He explicitly cited breaking and entering grand larceny and coordinated criminal conspiracy. The trap I had meticulously set had violently, perfectly snapped shut around their greedy, parasitic throats. The sheer panic of impending incarceration instantly shattered any maintaining illusion of their familial loyalty. The toxic family completely turned on one another, their voices rising in a chaotic symphony of vicious blame. Keisha frantically pointed a trembling finger at Patricia, loudly declaring that the matriarch had orchestrated the entire psychological warfare campaign. Jamal desperately attempted to claim he was merely following his wife's instructions, forcefully denying any personal knowledge of the jewelry's immense value. Patricia shrieked hysterically, denying everything, completely oblivious to the fact that her son was currently being shoved into a federal vehicle for stealing millions. The officers ignored their pathetic turning allegiances, executing their duties with practiced efficiency. The loud metallic click of handcuffs echoed repeatedly across the driveway as Keisha, Jamal, and Patricia were systematically restrained. The matriarch, who had spent the entire morning scrutinizing the dust on my baseboards and judging my worth as a mother, was now weeping uncontrollably as a police officer forcefully guided her head down into the back of a squad car. I stood perfectly still on the manicured lawn, watching with profound, detached satisfaction as the three parasites who had attempted to steal my child and my home were driven away in separate, heavily secured police cruisers. A time jump of 6 months illustrates the absolute destruction of my former antagonists, their toxic empire reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale of unchecked greed. Brandon, stripped entirely of his expensive suits and unearned prestige, now paces the barren concrete yard of a maximum security federal penitentiary. The undeniable digital evidence I meticulously compiled from his hidden ledgers ensured a swift, brutal conviction. He is currently facing a harsh, mandatory 15-year sentence for grand wire fraud and corporate embezzlement, utterly devoid of any possibility for early parole. The billionaire's stolen capital had been fully recovered, and Brandon's professional reputation was permanently obliterated. Keisha and Jamal fared no better within the state justice system. The crystal-clear 4K surveillance footage of their jewelry heist provided the prosecution with an absolutely impenetrable case that no defense attorney could ever hope to possibly dismantle in a courtroom setting. They are currently residing in a crowded, harsh, unforgiving county lockup facility, their former arrogant entitlement completely replaced by the miserable, suffocating reality of a lengthy prison term. The luxury lifestyle they had so desperately attempted to steal vanished, leaving them with absolutely nothing but heavy debt and identical orange jumpsuits. Patricia's ultimate downfall was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. The massive legal fees associated with her conspiracy charges entirely bankrupted her. Having permanently lost all her social standing, wealthy connections, and the financial support she previously extorted from her son, she was forced into absolute destitution. The woman who once prowled my estate judging my premium groceries is now working a grueling, physically demanding minimum wage shift at a local discount retailer just to survive. She lives alone in a rundown, cramped motel on the outskirts of the city, her days consumed by the bitter, inescapable realization that her own malice engineered her total isolation. Vanessa, the junior assistant who compromised her marriage for a taste of elite luxury, wanders the cold, unforgiving city streets, entirely destitute. Dominic's lethal zero-asset divorce decree left her heavily in debt, instantly stripping her of her downtown apartment and premium lifestyle. Furthermore, the ruthless billionaire utilized his immense corporate influence to ensure she was completely blacklisted from the financial sector. She is a ghost in the corporate world, utterly unable to secure even a basic entry-level position, paying the ultimate lifelong price for her willing participation in my husband's fraudulent schemes. Far removed from the wreckage of their shattered lives, my own reality has blossomed into a masterpiece of unbothered success and profound peace. The scene of my daily life now unfolds inside a breathtaking, sun-drenched penthouse located in a vibrant, entirely new city. Floor-to-ceiling windows offer panoramic, unobstructed views of a glittering skyline, casting warm, natural light across the polished, wide-plank hardwood floors. I sit comfortably at a sleek, modern glass desk, effortlessly reviewing highly successful financial portfolios for elite clients who value my unmatched forensic expertise and relentless dedication to truth. Just a few feet away from my workspace, my beautiful, healthy daughter Lily plays happily on a plush, expensive hand-woven rug. Her joyful, carefree laughter fills the massive, airy room, serving as a constant, beautiful reminder of the incredible life I fought so fiercely to protect. She is entirely safe, surrounded by unconditional love, and completely insulated from the toxic manipulation that once threatened to consume her future. The multi-million-dollar wealth I secured through the impenetrable blind trust remains perfectly intact, generating generational security that no greedy parasitic relative can ever hope to touch. My career is absolutely thriving, my physical recovery is completely healed, and I have successfully built a powerful, independent life entirely free of toxicity. The brutal challenges of the past have only forged a stronger, more resilient version of the woman I was always meant to be. The ultimate victory does not lie in the destruction of those who wronged me, but in the glorious, unyielding independence I secured from the ashes of their deceit. For every woman who has ever been underestimated, gaslit, or pushed to the absolute brink by a toxic family, remember that your greatest weapon is your own brilliant, calculating mind. Never surrender your worth to those who seek to exploit your vulnerability. If this story of strategic survival and ultimate justice resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more empowering stories of absolute karma and the triumph of the modern independent woman.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain through every trial.